Hello and welcome to this episode of the DigiPod. My name is Farieha Aziz. Today I am joined by Svea Windwehr. Today we want to get an understanding of exactly what the regulation debate is in the EU, where we'll be speaking particularly about the Digital Services Act, but of course there's a lot more legislation, regulation that is being debated over there. Svea, thank you for joining us. I know you are with the EFF and also are a co-chair of another digital association. If you could just contextualize a little bit about your work, and especially tell our audience about the DSA. What led to the enactment of the DSA?
Yeah, thank you so much, Ria, for having me. I'm really excited to be here. Right. So the DSA, the Digital Services Act, is the European Union's large sort of legal framework for different online platforms. So it covers a lot of different actors, online marketplaces, search engines, but also social media companies, which is, I think, what we most think about when we think about online platforms. So I'm going to focus on online media platforms because I think that is also where most of the issues come into focus most clearly. So, in the European Union, there has been a previous directive regulating and governing online platforms, the so-called e-commerce directive, that came into law, that came into effect in 2000, so 25 years ago, a long time ago. Since then, a lot of things have changed. On the one hand, digital services have changed quite significantly. And year 2000, most of the services that we use daily today didn't even exist. Like TikTok didn't exist. I think YouTube didn't even exist yet. Facebook hasn't been founded yet. So it was a very, very different landscape, very, very different issues, society related to digital services in really different ways. So that's one big change that led to this sort of update of the legal framework. The other one was that countries increasingly felt sort of a loss of control over what was happening on the web and specifically on social media. So there are concerns around hate speech, around disinformation, and there was a growing realization that the policy tools of the past, especially the e-commerce directive, which really only set out a liability regime, didn't really go far enough to help address these like more fundamental concerns. And these concerns then led to different European countries come up with their own national laws, which sort of led to a fragmentation of the European digital single market, or at least it was threatening this fragmentation. And this is why the European Commission, which is the entity in Europe that has legislative power over these kinds of things, the right to initiative, proposed the Digital Services Act alongside with its sister law, the Digital Markets Act, which takes the competition perspective. And we can talk about that later because it's actually also quite interesting. But those are sort of the factors leading to the DSA. And that was also why the DSA was hailed as sort of like a landmark law in the European Union, because it was really seen as like this general update of the legal framework applicable to online platforms. And you can also see that in the structure of the DSA consists of, I would say, three main parts, and there's a little bit more to it, but we can get into. But it sort of starts out with the basic liability regime, which is very similar to the e-commerce directive, which essentially says that platforms are not liable for user-generated content unless they have specific knowledge of a piece of illegal content and fail to act. Only in that case can they be held liable. Then the second part is a user right. So the DSA establishes a range of rights that users have towards online platforms. This is around mainly content moderation. So users have the right to notice, to essentially send a notice to a platform to alert them of a piece of potentially illegal content. They also have the right to redress. So when when a platform takes down content, they have transparency rights. So there is a quite extensive transparency reporting regime in the DSA. And then the third part is the so-called systemic risk approach, where the DSA sort of tries to go beyond the more traditional and established forms of platform regulation, which is really so more of like a ex post approach, right? Something bad happens, and then you try to remedy the bad thing that happened, like a piece of legal content, for example, was posted. So then you try to take down the content and establish rights around that. And the systemic risk approach sort of goes beyond that and looks more towards the future and thinks about what are systemic risks that are happening on these platforms and what is the responsibility of platforms to mitigate those risks from affecting societies. So those are the broad strokes. I'll leave it there.
So continuing actually with the broad strokes, because being based outside of the EU and also not in the US, there you see this sort of debate or perception where it's from a regulatory perspective, oftentimes EU regulation is referenced in terms of what should be adopted. Also, where platforms are concerned and platform accountability, where that comes in. In the US, you see a more free market approach, and so there's also the whole innovation versus regulation debate play out. But at the moment, it seemed, especially as of this year, there's a lot of tension between the US approach and the approach in the EU and how platforms are reacting or responding, or how the DSA has been also painted as this censorship tool. If you could speak to a little bit about that, because of course, even well-intended legislation, when it comes to implementation, there can be shortfalls. But if you could also place this sort of in the policy perspective of how it is being painted, and to my understanding or what we've been explained, the state or even and the EU Commission, it's not as if they have getting content removed per se. It's essentially the users who have the ability to report. Is that a correct understanding, or is there more to the DSA which then feeds into this perception of the censorship tool?
Yeah, thank you. That's a really good question. And so much, yeah, so much has been happening with regards to this in Europe. So maybe to start out with like a look back. So when the DSA was negotiated and adopted, online platforms overall had this posture of sort of wanting to be helpful. So a lot of online platforms said that they had some issues with the DSA, that it might, in some areas, it might be burdensome to comply with, but overall, they supported the DSA. That was the narrative, right? They supported harmonization and they supported the idea that they had some responsibility for the harm that was occurring on their platform. So I think there was no major platform that publicly was fundamentally against the DSA. A lot of platforms hailed it as sort of like an improvement of the current situation, again, like avoiding fragmentation. And also, a lot of the user rights that the DSA includes are things that platforms have done voluntarily for a long time, at least the big ones, which are really the ones most targeted by the DSA and have the highest or the most complex obligations to comply with. So, for example, things like a notice and action mechanism, a redress mechanism, transparency obligations. These are all things that most of the big platforms had been doing for years. Both sort of like out of like a self-regulatory instinct, but also I think sort of like knowing that these things are going to be coming anyways. And vice versa, the DSA also takes inspiration by things platforms have done in the past, like for example, trusted flagger programs. This is also something that DSA now mandates, something platforms came up themselves many years ago. So just to put that sort of into perspective, that was the overall sort of like attitudes towards the DSA. Things changed quite drastically when Donald Trump entered into office again in January. So already before him entering into office, we could see that some of the larger American tech companies changed their position towards the Trump candidacy or the campaign and the Republican Party in general and the platforms, the policy platforms they pushed. So some of the CEOs of these companies were donating to Trump's campaign, and especially Mark Zuckerberg from Meta was really seen to sort of, seen as trying to influence Donald Trump's understanding of some of these policies. This sort of came to a head during the campaign when JD Vance, so the now Vice President of the United States, threatened that the US might leave NATO if Elon Musk's X platform was fined under the DSA. So that was the first moment when it became apparent that this tension would be growing, and this tension hadn't really existed so much before. So Elon Musk, I think, was a bit of an exception. He was always in a bit of a tension with the European Commission around the DSA, and it was also apparent that of all the large platforms, X was definitely the worst in terms of compliance. So there was like a real economic incentive for Musk to get the Trump team on his side in this. So since then, we have seen the United States actually pushing in quite drastic terms against the DSA. So in transatlantic trade negotiations, the DSA is a major stumbling block. So apparently, this is just news over the weekend, but apparently the US is holding off on lowering import taxes on European cars unless the EU agrees on sort of shared language around the enforcement or non-enforcement of the DSA. So the DSA is really seen as a major stumbling block in this perspective for two reasons. On the one hand, the United States paints it as a censorship tool, as you already alluded to, and we can go back into that and sort of the how much truth there is to that claim a little bit. And the second argument is that the DSA is seen as a non-tariff barrier to trade. And that is because most of the large companies that are targeted by the DSA are American. So this is being painted as a protectionist policy measure to protect European companies and to, essentially, have special rules for American companies. This was never the intention from what I can tell. Also, TikTok, for example, as a Chinese company, falls under DSA and under the strictest obligations. But it is, of course, true that there is a certain dominance of American platforms in this market. When it comes to the censorship arguments, personally, to me, it seems like a huge misunderstanding and confusion of how the DSA works in practice. So one of the main arguments is that the DSA leads to the censorship or the takedown of content by American users. If we look at how platforms moderate online content, the established practice for years, and this is not touched by DSA at all, but the established practice for years has been that platforms take down content that violates national law locally, so they geo-block it, so it's not accessible in a particular geographic location. And they take down content that violates their own community standards globally, because those community standards are supposed to have a global reach. So it makes sense that this content that would be violating them would be taken down globally. The DSA doesn't change any of that. So in fact, the DSA itself doesn't prescribe what illegal content is and what isn't. This is up to European member states. So for example, German criminal law would be a little bit different from, let's say, French or Danish criminal law when it comes to certain forms of expression. For example, Holocaust denial is something that is a criminal offense in Germany, but it isn't in many other countries in the European Union for good political or good historic reasons. So in this case, a piece of content that denies a Holocaust would probably be taken down in Germany, and this could either happen because of a flag from a user. It could happen through a platform's own initiative. So they would themselves have crawlers and automated tools that would check content on the platform. Or it could also happen through a request from a national authority to take down a specific piece of content. But that content would only be blocked in Germany, but not beyond Germany. So in that sense, this argument that the content of American users is censored through the DSA doesn't really hold up in practice, because that's just not how the mechanism works at all. So I see it more sort of like as an element of the culture war where American politicians are trying to assert a certain perspective on freedom of expression on other parts of the world, and really try to reframe this economic issue that the DSA is expensive to comply with as a freedom of expression issue.
And if you could just segue into some of the other sort of regulation debates in the EU at the moment, because I mean, as you say, the DSA was envisioned as this law to essentially protect users from harm, for example, what's available online, and especially the actual knowledge sort of they have platforms have that shield, but a lot of things are changing, especially as we talk about algorithms and AI. And what is used on the information data collected in real time. I know that there's the AI Act that's being debated as well. There's reform happening to the GDPR. If you could basically tell us what exactly in the EU with all of these laws that are being debated, and also how technology sometimes outpaces law. Just the rapid developments and the nature of also the harms, especially with AI now, or as we talk about, deep fakes or non-consensual images, but the nature in which, they're being made, the scale, how they're being shared. How effectively do you think, I mean, I'm sure there are local critiques of the laws as well. If you could run us through those as well.
Yeah, definitely. So there are two interesting trends happening at the same time that sort of go in opposite directions. So on the one hand, European Commission has been presenting this deregulatory agenda since they started taking office a little bit more than a year ago. So European Union essentially works the way that the European Commission and the Parliament are elected for 5 years and then they switch terms. So the last term, this European Commission, still led by the same party, the same person, the European Commission was really seen as championing these huge regulatory frameworks, the DSA, the DMA, the AI Act, which I think is something the European Commission was particularly proud of, that Europe was seen as the first region in the world to regulate AI comprehensively. So the same laws that were celebrated just a year ago are now coming increasingly under attack for pretty much the same reason. They're all seen as containing too much red tape, as being bad for innovation and stifling sort of Europe's economic growth trajectory. This is a narrative that is very, very strongly pushed by both European but also American industry actors who have been very, very outspoken, especially against the AI Act. The Act is interesting in the sense that it hasn't entered into force yet, so we don't actually know how this works in practice and how much red tape there would be in practice. The AI Act follows a risk-based approach, which means that the highest amount of obligations would fall on a very small number of actors, and the majority of AI on the market wouldn't actually be affected by the AI Act. But again, we don't really know yet what this would look like in practice because the AI Act hasn't entered into force. Despite that, there are huge discussions underway about delaying the entry into force, about changing some of the rules before they even are become applicable. So there is, on the one hand, there's like really strong push to weaken the AI Act, to soften it, to water it down. On the other hand, as you say, there is also a growing frustration with how effective these laws, especially these A, have been in practice. So, especially around issues like the use of AI in generating misinformation, in generating gender-based violative content or content that violates the privacy and rights of women in particular. There is growing frustration that the DSA doesn't actually deliver, and people haven't felt like a massive change in their online experiences. So I think this is sort of like where we're at right now. On one hand, there is definitely a push to water down these laws and to decrease compliance obligations for companies. On the other hand, I think many people, especially from civil society, from people affected by certain types of online content, feel like things actually haven't changed that much. It still takes effort to notify companies of specific content, to go through the takedown process, to have content reinstated when it was taken down wrongfully. Like all of that is still cumbersome and really depends on the initiative of users. So yeah, I think especially when it comes to the use of generative AI tools in these contexts, I don't think the European Union has necessarily found an answer that has been really satisfying for a lot of people.
And given that you come from the civil society space, you work with the EFF presently, but you also are part of the advisory council, right, for the German digital services as a coordinator. What has there been sort of a reflection or input? And also on the user end, has there been any sort of metric to gauge really how users are responding to some of this and how they're perceiving this? And any policy recommendations that are now being made? Now, it seems as if the Commission is sort of shifting its approach. At this point, what is being recommended by civil society and rights groups?
Mm. Yeah, so I am part of the advisory council of the Digital Service Coordinator, and that is the regulatory authority in charge of implementing or overseeing the implementation of the DSA in Germany specifically. And maybe just for background, this advisory council is not something that the DSA itself prescribes, but it's something that the German government came up with in the transposition process of transposing the DSA international law. So it's unique, actually. We're the only one in Europe. I think at the moment, civil society is in a really challenging position because, on the one hand, there are some things that are not working super well, and I think there's like a lot of small tweaks that I think could help users just being more aware of the rights under the DSA. There's also a huge missing piece, which is public education. There haven't really been major campaigns to tell people about the DSA, to educate users about their rights. This is something I personally find absolutely fascinating because I think it's such a low-hanging fruit, right? Just tell people what has changed and educate them about their rights. But this hasn't really happened yet so much. So on the one hand, I think there is some frustration, especially when it comes to platforms, assessment and mitigation of systemic risks. There, society has formulated a lot of frustrations around the lack of data, the lack of insight, the fact that society is not really involved or, yeah, being essentially being asked for feedback on these processes. So this is really frustrating, and I think there, I think a lot of people could easily come up with suggestions and policy recommendations. On the other hand, I think the issue is that people are really worried to reopen the DSA so early and potentially making it worse. So that is why civil society actors, from what I've seen, are very, very hesitant at this point to formulate any recommendations or expectations for change because no one wants to take the risk to open the DSA and potentially lose some of the protections that have been established in this current deregulatory climate where we just don't know how things might end up.
And also, since you mentioned that there is a shift with big tech, especially, and a lot of the tech is concentrated in the US, the ownership at least. And so politically, I mean, we're seeing a lot of polarization world over. And so this is impacting societies, and also what is happening online is a manifestation of it. How do you see going forward, especially civil society engagement with big tech, which has also been there, but in terms of the receptivity, also the ability to sort of keep the focus on harms. Of course, there has been critique, irrespective, but now with the changing political climate, do you think that this is becoming even more difficult?
Yeah, I think there is a growing discussion among civil society whether it is worth engaging in the same way that we have before, or whether that sort of contributes to almost like an ethics washing of what companies are doing and their compliance. I think there are some concerns around who are we benefiting, right? If we continue to have these conversations, and could it be that we're not actually benefiting us and our causes, but these platforms to be able to sort of present themselves as good corporate citizens? Um, I think the DSA and the DMA have also really changed the conversation, at least in the European Union, for civil society when it comes to engaging with big tech platforms, because now a lot of the conversations used to that we used to have are framed as compliance discussions by companies. So they're a lot less happy to engage, from my experience. It is different people who would engage with us. It is now often compliance or legal departments, not necessarily the public policy or human rights experts that we used to have access to. So I think that also really changes the conversation. And I personally feel like these laws and their, which of course I support, but I think like having these laws in place has changed the tone because now companies are worried that society will present them with cases of non-compliance, which could come with really hefty fees in a DSA, and not just sort of with instances of this has gone poorly, how can we improve this process, but really something that they might want to bring to attention of regulators. So I think that has really changed the flavor of conversation. Yeah, and I think beyond that, what you have just alluded to is true, right? I mean, the overall, um, yeah, the overall tone seems to have changed. The overall environment, seems to have changed, and I think a lot of people are growing increasingly, unwilling to engage, which I understand. I mean, personally, I do think there is a value in building the bridges and staying in contact, but I understand the frustration that some people have about just yeah, having these the same conversations that don't lead to any real change.
So as we sort of conclude this conversation going forward and given where we are at, how do you foresee or anticipate what are the challenges that you perhaps anticipate in terms of securing user rights and holding platforms accountable, but also making sure that laws don't become oppressive or also redundant in a manner where the efficacy for users just doesn't exist anymore? I know that's a lot and there's a lot to wade through and there's clear answers, but just maybe in terms of pointing out what the conversation needs to be about going forward.
Yeah. I think we really need to focus on a rights-based approach to enforcement. So enforcement is obviously really important, but I don't think the focus should be on enforcing the DSA and similar laws, which of course always include the potential for abuse and misuse. the focus shouldn't be on enforcing necessarily the law to the letter, but to really sort of follow the spirit of a rights protective environment and to use a DSA to strengthen user rights, to hold platforms accountable, but be very, very mindful of the potential effects on fundamental rights, especially freedom of expression. I think for that, there have been a lot of positive steps in the right direction. The European Commission has been very active as a regulator, but we haven't really seen a lot of results yet. So this is something that I am looking forward to. We haven't seen any of the large investigations concluded. We haven't seen any fines communicated so far. And I think there's a lot of room for improvement when it comes to the involvement of civil society, of creating transparency around enforcement processes, and also around just the competence and know-how of regulatory authorities. I think there's a long way to go for these authorities to be able to interact with these platforms at eye level. So I think that is what we need to move towards and work towards. And I think involving society, involving independent researchers in this work will be absolutely crucial to both level up the expertise, but also make sure that the DSA is enforced in a manner that protects fundamental rights, protects users, and strengthens the overall accountability environment of platforms.
So thank you so much for making time for DawnNews English. I think for us, the lessons are also that while we look at the EU as a regulatory environment where we should just adopt and copy paste from, there are concerns locally as well. And I think there has to be a little more assessment on what works, what doesn't work. And this is something that we're seeing play out. So those are the lessons that we need to also take heed from. Thank you. This is all that we have on the DigiPod today.
Thank you so much.